today we're going to continue through 27. Okay, so chapter 27. Last week we covered the first 13 verses. Here now we're doing the middle portion, the storm in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And then next week we'll finish off the chapter with when they shipwreck. Okay, so it's a bit more voluminous in regards to the verses, right? So we're doing verses 14 to 38, right? But we're doing that simply because much of this portion is details. There's not a whole lot of explanatory points that are required, right? So we'll read the passage and then go from there. Acts chapter 27, verses 14 to 38. But before very long there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Evraquillo. And when the ship, your translations probably say the northeaster or something like that. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be carried along. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship. Fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be carried along. And the next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they cast the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice to not set sail from Crete, and to avoid this damage and loss. Now I advise you to be cheerful, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore be cheerful, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told, but we must run aground on some island.' But when the 14th night came, as we were being carried about the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to suspect that some land was approaching them. And when they took soundings, they found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little farther on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and were praying for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay our anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes in the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them to take some food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is your salvation. For not a hair from your head or from any of you will perish.' And having said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. And all of them became cheerful, and they themselves also took food. And all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, much of this portion reads like a medieval folktale about a group of hardy sailors getting lost at sea, and the story that unfolds, right? This is very much one of those, probably the most in the book of Acts, the most voluminous in its details about one singular event, and you might be thinking, why on earth are we getting like all these details about this trip and so on and so forth? Some of it we'll explain as we go through. There are some broader spiritual points that can be made, certainly ones that are more, there are some important allegorical or symbolic points. And again, I've said this many times in this church, allegorical or symbolic does not equal not real. Okay, we often sometimes have that false conception that symbolic somehow means something's not real. That's not what symbolism means. Symbols or allegories are actually tools or mechanisms to convey truth, not to somehow pretend that something's untrue. So there are some broader allegorical truths here, or symbolic truths, but nevertheless, then there are some more pragmatic ones, of course, as well. Some of the things we read there, you may not immediately understand what it's referencing, and that's okay. People of the Mediterranean who are far more familiar with seafaring and the things of the Mediterranean immediately understood what these were referring to, right, in their cultural context. So for some of the narrative elements, I'll bridge the gap if there's any issue there. But anyway, let's begin in verse 14. But before very long, they were rushed down from the land. So they're rushed down from the land, right, in other words, from the coastline, a violent wind called Evraquillo in Latin, Euraquillo. Majority of English translations, I assume, bring it into northeasterner or northeaster. Yeah, that's what that means. So Evros or Evru, meaning an east was the Greek name for the easterly wind. And again, this is actually the translation I'm reading for is reading it actually from the Latin. This wind was known as Evrakilon. The northeaster, kilos or kilon was another word for north. There are a number of different words. Some of you would actually be familiar with it, whether you realise it or not. The regular word or the more common word for the northern wind in Greek, boreos, which is where we refer to the things as the borealis. Yeah, so the aurora borealis, the northern lights, and the aurora australis, the southern lights. Okay, so boreos. Boreas, if you want to think of it in English, the north, the legendary land of Hyperborea in Greek mythology, etc., etc. This utopian place that existed beyond the north wind, etc. This is what this is referring to. Okay, so he's using an actual term for the northeastern wind that carries itself across the Mediterranean. That northeast wind typically flows from kind of the Ionian Sea, right? It still does to this day, of course. So the Ionian Sea is what exists between Greece and Sicily, right, or southern Italy. People are usually familiar with the Greek Isles, the about 96 islands that exist in the Aegean Sea, so between what today is Greece and Turkey. But there are actually a handful of islands on the western side called the Ionian Islands. Okay, Zakynthos, Kefalonia, Ithaki, where the famous King Odysseus was from the Odyssey. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. But nevertheless, from those islands, right, so from the western side of Greece, south of the Adriatic Sea, Evrakilon, that wind, which today has it would have an Italian name, but as they all tend to at the moment, the Gugale, I think it is, I remember that one. That wind prevails down from the northeast, as the name assumes, across the middle of the Mediterranean, over where Malta is, and then down into what is basically Tunisia, where Carthage is, right? So northeaster wind. So they get caught up in this. This is what it's referring to, right? So the violent wind, the northeaster, right, or the northeasterner, the Evraquillo, the Evrakilon, etc., etc. And when the ship was caught in it, we could not face the wind. We gave way to it and let ourselves be carried along, which is about all they could do. So this storm is brewing in the very heart of the Mediterranean, right? They're smack bang in the middle of the Mediterranean at this point. Okay, so some of the deepest waters in the Mediterranean, and seas can get a bit choppy out there. As we'll see. And so verse 16, and running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda or Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. So the ship's boat means, as in if you're familiar at all with boats, the skiff, right? The lifeboat, if you want to think of it like that. Okay. Ships would always have a skiff, right? A rescue vessel that you can then, if you have to abandon ship, you can then depart in that rowboat. Okay, right? A skiff. So that was battering around and being shaken as it's tied up and so on, so they could barely get that under control, right? After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, fearing that it might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, right, another island, and they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be carried along, right? So this is to stop. They're trying to slow their speed in order to not be moving at such a pace that they, for starters, are not able to control how quickly they are heading towards islands or shallow water, right? They don't want to be going anywhere near as fast as...
They're still moving even with the anchor down. They're dragging.
They're being dragged. Yeah. They're trying to slow their speed. The faster they head into shallow water, again, it's just basic physics. If you're driving, the difference between driving 40 kilometres an hour around a bend versus 140 kilometres around a bend, you have much less time to turn, right? Okay, and to make manoeuvres, right? So yes, verse 18. And the next day, as we were being violently storm tossed, they, as in the crew, began to jettison the cargo, right? So they're dumping cargo. Part of this, again, is also trying to lighten in order to, if they shipwreck, the heavier the ship, the quicker it will sink. Okay, so they make the decision to start jettisoning cargo, so putting their lives above their finance, which is a smart decision. Verse 19, on the third day they cast the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, right, so raining, storms, overcast, etc., throughout the day and night, right? Hence the reference. We've seen neither sun nor stars appearing for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. No, there's a great storm was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned, right? Again, that should be fairly sure what's being described here. This storm's getting worse and worse and worse, and as they're further out, and as they're further travailing through the seas, the storm's not letting up. It's getting worse, in fact, and they are losing hope very, very rapidly.
So is this day 3 of the storm, or since they've set sail?
No, day 3 of the storm.
Oh.
Yep. So verse 21. And when they had gone a long time without food, right, because they'd already made that decision to start jettisoning some of the cargo, and which would include obviously naturally some of the food. When they'd gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete, and to avoid the damage and loss." Okay, so he's stating the obvious, basically, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't have been happy with him saying that.
No, but then again, at the same time, there's a time for "I told you so" and there's a time for holding back the "I told you so's." But what happens is, because we don't like getting "I told you so," we end up telling ourselves that people should never say "I told you so."
Yeah, this is true. Especially if it's coming from someone like Paul. It's worth listening to.
No doubt. There are times for "I told you so," and there are times for wisdom to not say "I told you so," just because it would be a net negative, not net positive. But there are absolutely times for "I told you so," because sometimes when people make dumb decisions, contrary to sound and evident advice, telling someone "I told you so" is what helps them to actually learn from whatever calamity they happen to have brought down upon themselves as a result of their stupid decision in the first place. Sometimes in life, the "I told you so" would only break someone further, right? So I'm saying there's wisdom. But other times, fools need to be shown their folly, is the simple way of putting it. So "I told you so's." To give you a tangible example of this, everything that could ever be said about COVID is one giant example of why people need to be told "I told you so."
Yeah.
So that's not one of those scenarios where you should hold back the "I told you so." No, you should say the "I told you so,"
Yeah.
because people did it out of people didn't do it out of. There are plenty of people who did it out of sincerity, but people in positions of authority who made decisions did it much more out of arrogance and hubris and out of self-righteousness than they did out of genuineness. Okay, and I'll defend that claim 6 ways to Sunday.
That's true.
And so in those instances, it's "I told you so." People who were small business owners or who were employees, who work for such and such business or such and such corporation, or they have their own small business, like I said, and the government rolls along and says you will get jabbed or we'll shut your business down and you'll lose your livelihood and you can't pay your mortgage, and then the bank will take your house, and that mercy, right? Mercy. People were put between. Many people were put between a rock and a hard place, like they'd never faced before. And I'm not going to say "I told you so" to those people. I will say "I told you so" to politicians and to government bureaucrats and to church pastors and to doctors. Sure, yep, all the above, university, whatever, blah blah blah. To pastors, etc. They get the "I told you so's." Right?
Yeah.
So there's a balance, right? But you can learn that lesson from this, right? As I'm saying to you, even in seemingly simple details, you can draw many principles.
I have to say though, I just had a little flash of like, because drowning's probably my room 101. That is my worst nightmare. I have a total phobia of drowning.
Well, most people do, right? Drowning's a rough death.
Yeah, it kind of interferes with the breathing process.
They say it's very pleasant.
Yeah, I don't believe that for a minute.
Drowning's a rough way to go. Yep.
I don't believe that for a minute. So having someone...
It feels like you're drowning, I've heard.
Just awful. So having someone in the middle of all this madness, and I can just see myself clinging on to anything, and having someone go, well, I would have just lost it, I think.
But the difference is you would have deserved it.
But he's right. I'm not saying... I just know I would not have reacted well.
But there is a reason why he uses the "I told you so," and you'll get to that by the time we get to toward the end of it, right? So he says, "I told you so" in verse 21. Verse 22, "And now I advise you to be cheerful, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship." Okay, so his "I told you so" doesn't just sit blankly, right? His "I told you so" has light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, so again, like I said, balance of things, which also plays on exactly what I was just saying earlier. So, an "I told you so" being given to whenever someone needs to hear "I told you so," it shouldn't be done from the place of "I told you so" because you're an idiot and I'm the smartest person that's ever existed.
From arrogance.
Right, correct, yeah. "I told you so" must be done for the benefit of the person being told "I told you so." Right? "I told you so" should be done to help someone see the light on an issue. And if it's not done from that place, it becomes arrogant and prideful, right? And self-righteous. So "I told you so" is necessary at times and should be done with the desire of actually genuinely helping the person see the error of their ways so that they can do the right thing in the future. Otherwise all it does, "I told you so" just becomes a vehicle for bitterness and for spitefulness and unforgiveness. Yeah. So the "I told you so," and this is actually the primary passage in all of Scripture for "I told you so" that I ever use. There are many, many others like it, but this is a very evident example. His "I told you so" is immediately followed by an encouragement. "Now I advise you to be cheerful," right? So I want you to notice as well, he's not being a smart aleck, he's being clever. So I want you to hone in on the word "advice," right? So verse 21, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice." Right? In other words, heeded it, right? "You ought to have followed my advice to not set sail from Crete and avoid the damage of being lost. Now I advise you to be cheerful, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." So he already advised them to not set sail because this was going to turn out badly, and it's turned out badly just like he advised them. Now he's giving them a second piece of advice and basically tongue-in-cheek saying to them, "I wonder if you followed this piece of advice." Do you understand? So he's saying, "I advised you on this thing earlier and you didn't listen to my advice. Now I'm advising you that none of us will die if you actually follow my instructions. So, and as we progress through the story, you'll see that they change their tune and do follow this advice. So, verse 23, for this very night, and then he gives the explanation why now, right? For this very night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Right? Granted all of them. In other words, granted to preserve their life. Right? Therefore, be cheerful, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told, but we must run aground on some island. Okay? So he's telling them what's going to happen. People in the ancient world were much more receptive to these kinds of things because they were not atheists. Okay? And so, yeah, he told them that this was a bad idea to set sail from Crete, and that they were going to hit a storm and it was going to be bad, blah, blah, blah. They did not listen to that advice. Now everything that Paul said would happen has already happened, and so now you have reason to perhaps listen to him. They will run aground, they will shipwreck, but no one will die. Right? Hence his words of no one will lose any life among you, but only the ship. Verse 22. Okay, the ship's going down, and that's unavoidable. But we will survive. So verse 27. But when the 14th night came, so we've jumped forward from 3 days into now 2 weeks into this, right?
Kidding.
Again, this would be coming in waves, pardon the pun, right? But it's that time again. Their whole decision back at Crete was do we winter in southern Crete or not, right? They know they're in September, October. They're in a very turbulent time with regards to storms across the Mediterranean, right? We know that because he mentioned the feast is in the Feast of Tabernacles, right? So we know exactly when they are. We are in exactly September, October of AD 59. Okay, so we can date it because of those references. So they're in storm season. That's why they were deciding about wintering in that, right? But they're in late autumn, well, in the northern hemisphere, obviously, right? They're in late autumn. You've got storms that are prevailing, the winds prevailing as it's starting to head into winter. This is exactly what's occurring here. Okay.
Is that why Paul said that it's dangerous to go out there?
Yes, exactly. It wasn't broadly an act of pure prophecy or clairvoyance. It was
reason.
Reason. Yes. Like you didn't have. I made this point. You didn't have to be a prophet to know that this was not the best decision, right? They're in mid to late autumn, and wanting to go out in the high seas when the winds get very wild, especially in these parts of the Mediterranean. Okay. This was not a smart decision, right?
Was it a business decision? The captain and the pilot saying, "Well, we have to get there."
Correct. It was
too much money.
They had a debate. To be fair to them, they had a lot of discussion about it. They debated it back and forth, and they decided to roll the dice. Now there's a balance. Men on the high seas, by definition, are rolling the dice in the first place, and men on the high, even to these, exactly. I mean, even today, you're still taking elements of risk. Now the risks are very different and much lower than they were ever before. Whether you're talking about a small voyage, again, this trip from Crete to Malta is much smaller than Magellan deciding, and the Spanish and the Portuguese deciding to sail and to circumnavigate the world, or for Francis Drake to do it in one trip in three, or for Cook to traverse the Pacific, and all these various decisions that so there's a scale of things, right? Sailing the high seas has always been an inherent risk. And so these men are risk takers by definition, in a basic sense anyway. Them rolling the dice is them doing just that, and when you roll the dice sometimes you land, when you roll the dice sometimes you don't. And this is This is one of the don't. This is one of the don't. You can pitch and toss about wise decisions. I mean, this is nowhere near. This is not a wise decision. It's very severely rolling. It's a big, massive risk, a bigger risk than they ever should have taken. But at the end of the day, sailors, right, men on the high seas, it's a risk-taking activity. So them.
You've got 4 days, 14 nights.
Yeah.
In like a washing machine, like no thank. I would have been a nervous wreck.
Correct.
And they hadn't eaten anything in all that time.
They're probably violently ill.
14 days.
X amount of food will have been ruined by, because you got to understand that you've got significant waves which are washing up on deck, getting into the galley below. So elements of food get spoiled in that condition. Right, you got salt water washing all over them. They've already had to jettison significant portions of their cargo. So that's more stock and food, etc. They dumped the wheat not long after this. So they're dumping some of the cargo in order to lighten the ship if it shipwrecks, because the lighter the ship, the slower it will sink. And so they've run out of food. At least in terms of like they're rationing heavily what they're doing. They have food obviously, but they're rationing heavily. Yeah, very heavily rationing. So when the 40th night came, we were being carried about in the Adriatic Sea. So again, the Adriatic was used to describe all of what today is really the Adriatic and then the Ionian. Okay, if you look on your little maps there, do you have one? Yep, you do. If I can bring mine up too. So you see, you if you look up in the top left, you'll see.
You've got a different one.
Oh, a whole lot.
You might need a.
Might be the one we got last week.
The one that we got last week, yes. It'll say Paul. It'll say in the bottom left, map of Paul's journey to Rome.
Is it that one?
No, that's the old one.
one?
That's the old one. The other ones have obviously been taken for interest. If you just share those ones for this time.
I came last week.
Anyway, between Macedonia and Italy, right, the Adriatic Sea. If you see it in blue there, next to Italy. So the Adriatic is what's up there's all of the Balkans. So countries like, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. Blah blah. The Adriatic is technically that portion up there, where you see, if you look in Achaia, okay, so see cities like Olympia, Delphi, Sparta, etc. Okay, that sea between Olympia and then if you head left into southern Italy, Rhegium, Rhegium, that's what we generally refer to as the Ionian Sea. Okay. I mentioned those Ionian islands. If you look where the word Olympia is in Greece, just above the letter O, see a couple of islands around there?
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the Ionian islands. Okay. And so those the big island there is Kefalonia. There's a tiny little island right next to it, a very smidge one. That's Ithaki, or Ithaca. That's what I was referring to earlier. Anyway, but this journey they've come over from, you can see Klavda, right, or Klauda, which is, if you look on the island of Crete, where Phoenix is, right, we were in there last week, the island of Crete. So above the word Mediterranean or south of Sparta, that island of Crete, that's where they set sail from, right, where we were last week. They go, and you can follow this journey as they're coming across the middle of the Mediterranean, right? So to come back to the text, the Adriatic Sea, broadly at least, certainly in the ancient context, was really used to describe all the way down to where we are in this portion as well, right? Certainly where the wind's coming from. We tend to refer to this as the Ionian Sea these days, and have for a while, but yes, nevertheless. So the 40th night came as we were being carried about in the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors began to suspect that some land was approaching them, right? And when they had took soundings, so soundings is where you lower down a rope to figure out how deep the water is in that particular setting, okay? And then you bring it back up, and then you measure the water line, right? You measure how much rope, and then you can figure out how deep the water is, right? A sounding, okay? So when they took soundings, they found it to be 20 fathoms. So a fathom, we're not terribly familiar with what a fathom is these days. We tend to use the word fathom as in, do you fathom a concept, right? A fathom in naval terminology, fathom is about 6 foot. Okay, so 1.8 meters, right? So in this context, we found it to be 20 fathoms. In other words, 20 times 6, so in other words, 120 feet. Okay, so 120 feet deep, et cetera, which is a little bit over 35 meters. Let's call it 36 meters roughly. So 36 meters. So deep, right? But the point is that then they're comparing it to, and a little farther along, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms, right? So it's getting shallower and shallower, okay? So they know that they're getting close to an island or to land, to shallow waters, right? So not good, not what they want. And fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, wise assessment, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and were praying for daybreak, okay? So they're reduced down to basically praying to anyone that will hopefully answer. So they would be praying, these guys here would be praying to Poseidon. They'd be first and foremost praying to Poseidon, or his Roman equivalent Neptune, okay? That's who they first and foremost absolutely would be praying to. They would be praying to Zeus as well in regards to the storm itself, the lightning and everything else, the winds, blah, blah. So many prayers would be given here to Poseidon and to Zeus, or to Neptune and Jupiter, right? Their equivalents, Roman equivalents. Most of these men here are going to be Greek because they're coming from the east anyway, right? This ship was from Alexandria. It then docked up in, back up. It then docked up in Myra, right, where they then had changed over. Right, so Myra in Lycia, Myra, right. So they were on an Adramyttian ship, and they then transferred ships in Myra. This ship was an Alexandrian ship, so it had come up from Alexandria, Egypt, north to Myra, done some business there, and now it was heading over to eventually to Rome. Okay, on a much longer cargo haul. So these guys are. They're Roman centurions, so they would be praying to Neptune and others. The Greek guys would be praying to Poseidon, but again, those are the same deities, just by different names, right? And then there's this little group of Christians on there as well, right? Who are praying to the only one who can do a damn thing about it. So yes. Again, you can make other points here as well. This is very much an example of of a modern idiom in English. There's no atheists in a foxhole, right? There's no atheists in the trenches. When death starts breathing down one's neck, people have a very fascinating way of dumping their previous atheistic pretenses. Some don't, just many do, because it's very easy and comfortable to hold to atheistic or secular worldviews when things are kind of going nice and smoothly in life, and then when things start getting real, it's
Only Paul Sartre and Camus.
Yes, yeah.
Both turned
Yes.
to religion when they
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, exactly. Talking about modernist and postmodern philosophers of the last 100 plus years now. Yes, and the last couple of centuries. Yes, no, that's a good example of it. Exactly. Hardline secular humanists or atheistic philosophers and other such, have had those kinds of experiences. Because what happened again? When these things get dire in the literal sense, right? They get very real. One's confidence in how absolutely sure they are there's nothing more to life than just what you said, that's when it's really put to the test. The test isn't when things are smooth sailing and you're just living your 9-to-5 job and you come home to your 2.2 children and your car and your white picket fence and your dog in the front yard, you know what I mean? And it's not, I'm saying it tongue in cheek, but that's kind of the essence of what it is. Like, Well, it's not even necessarily hedging the bets in the thing. These guys are already religious, so there's a difference, right? My point is, these guys are not. But see how much an individual. See the nature of ancient, without turning this into too long of a portion. I could talk about this forever, but we're in a Greco-Roman context here, but this would apply in any other setting. But it was very much the case in the Greco-Roman world. How much personal piety and devotion one had on an individual level to the gods could vary greatly, right? Very, very, very few people ever actually sincerely and genuinely held the belief that the whole thing was just a load of nonsense. There's no gods. Like atheism is not something it's a very post-Enlightenment thing. Socrates was the charge that he faced was corrupting the youth of Athens with atheism, and what that actually constituted was him asking questions about whether or not the gods were actually benevolent, in other words, good, and if they're not as good as we might appear, do we rightly understand the gods in the first place? So not like outright what you'd get in just like kind of very modern Richard Dawkins type atheism of, oh no, religion's nonsense. And it's like no one, even Socrates' basic questions of that constituted atheism, right? He never even outright denied the existence of spiritual things or the divine or anything else like that. So my point that I'm drawing here is that how much these 276 guys, as we're told here later at the end of the passage, how many of these 276 guys on board were deeply pious and regularly visited temples and this and prayed, but who knows, right? Some more than others. That would be the average assessment, right? Some guys hardly at all, some guys plenty. Some of the guys who are at least probably the captain of the ship and the actual pilot and some of the other lieutenants of the ship would probably be a bit more committed. They would probably make regular sacrifices to figures like Poseidon and Zeus and others for blessings in their journeys so that they don't get caught in this scenario. Mm-hmm. Whatever offering they gave up in Alexandria clearly didn't work. But that journey would have been blessed by. I can virtually guarantee you for a fact, knowing Greco-Roman history and culture, this journey would not have proceeded without a sacrifice and a blessing that would have been sought at the temple of Poseidon or of Zeus or of others.
Wow.
That's just not. That was a routine element. This might seem like an odd thing to say, but the reality was that only an idiot would not do it, from their perspective. Someone with a death wish would not do it. That's the perspective. Now, part of this is the point, and I'll wait till we get to the end of this to make one of those big and meta-narrative points. I'll leave it for now, and I'll get back to it when we get to the end. So verse 30, but as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat, right, that's the skip I was referring to, into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Okay. So there's been a variety of different ways in which, well, not variety, as in like a variety of times that people have written about this, I should really say, throughout church history as to how they've taken this little dynamic in the story, right? In how this plays out. The question has always been, is Paul offering obvious reasonable advice again, or is Paul actually saying, unless they remain in the boat, the promise that God made won't come to be? Both of which you could probably reasonably read out of that text. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Both of them work. There's nothing necessarily or strictly that would preclude one from the other. Part of the broader point you could definitely clearly draw is he has already told them that they will survive this, they're still in a frantic panic. Okay, that's obvious. Like that would go no matter how you're reading this text. Okay.
So can I just clarify? So the sailors are basically getting themselves into the skip, saying, "Oh, we'll put the anchors out. We'll put the anchors out."
Yeah, they're coming up.
And in actual fact, they just want to get out. They're just fleeing. Is that?
Well, no, they're probably actually trying to do that. I think you can take the wording
Okay.
I think you can certainly take the wording of that for sure. But this is my point. See, it doesn't strictly have to. This can just be. It can be both as well. It can be reasonable advice that's also tying into how God is sovereign over this, right? So what you have to keep in mind as a foundational thing weaving its way throughout this passage is Paul has already communicated to them they will survive this. Okay, they'll survive this. However, the good idea fairies are still coming up with 1,000 bright ideas about how they think they're going to save themselves from this mess, right? We're going to get in the skiffs and we're going to directly lay down the anchors from the bow, right? Which would be it's difficult, but it's a more direct way. They can tie it off better, blah blah blah. That skiff's also going to get torn apart because it's a tiny little skiff, and you're all going to die in the attempt. Is also what will happen. But you're not thinking about that because you're trying to come up with grand solutions about how you're going to fix something which you have no power over in the first place. The reality is that these guys are a kite in a hurricane, right? They're not fixed. They're not fixing this. The way that you fix this is by not setting sail from Crete. That's how you fix this. Okay. And again, the meta-narrative points. The meta-narrative points. In other words, the big picture points I'm saving for the end, right? And I'll wait till the end for that too, right? Where are we? Yes, I'll read verse 30 again. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of, you asked me about are some of them trying to escape? Yeah, sure. But they're also laying down anchors from the bow, right? On the pretense. That's what I'm saying to you about. It was a both. Like on the pretense, in other words, we're gonna do this and do that, and then they're going to escape afterwards in the skiffs. Right, so that's what I was saying. It's a both. It's a yes, but under the pretense of we're going to lay down the bows. So trying to escape from the ship on the pretense that they intend to lay down anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Okay, so the centurions actually listened.
Did we assume that Paul was told this?
Well, yes, he'd already been told back in whatever verses it was.
23.
Yeah, 20 yeah, basically
24.
23 to 24, essentially, or 23 to 26, basically, those verses. He's already been told that they will survive this. Yes, so
Survive it, but
they will survive. The ship will get shipwrecked, and they'll make it through, but they will survive. Yes. But they need to remain in the ship. If they try and abandon ship, they're going to die. Okay. Pardon me. Therefore, actually, I'll go back. Sorry, pardon me, missed a bit there. One more little point on verse 32. So he says to the centurion and the soldiers under him to cut off. That they need to stay in the boat, and they listen. They immediately listen. So the Roman soldiers obey Paul. Okay. It's not the first time we've seen the Roman soldiers obeying the words of the Christians. Right? We've actually seen this multiple times. We've also seen that the very first person who actually had faith in him, other than the disciples, was a Roman centurion in the Gospels. Right, with the Roman who brought whose servant boy, right, son, who was ill, and he said if I'm paraphrasing, he said if you say be healed, it will be done. You don't even need to be there, right?
Was
and that's
there only
where
one centurion?
here, yes, only one centurion, yes, for this size of yes. So there's a centurion in charge, and there's X amount of soldiers, and then the rest are crewmen, or other people journeying, who knows? But at least crewmen and these troops, yes. Yes, there's one centurion in charge here. Yes, verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day," right? So it's now after that night, right? So in verse 27, when the 14th night came, now into the day itself. Okay, so daybreak. Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your salvation, right? Because you'll starve if you don't. In other words, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Having said these things, he took bread. Oops, sorry, missed the line. Going back. There we go. Verse 35. Sorry. And having said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And he broke it and began to eat. And all of them became cheerful, and they themselves also took food. Now this is interesting. So I'm just skipping down to this portion in my Greek text. 35. Yep. So what he is doing here, he himself, and obviously you can say by assumption Luke and the other one whose name escapes me, we saw him, where is he? Aristarchus, the Macedonian, right, the other Christian who's up in verse 2 all the way back at the very beginning. Him taking bread, and so if you read verse 35 again, having said these things, he took bread and gave it to them all in the presence of God, and he began to eat. Right, and all of them became cheerful, blah, blah, blah. There's a reason why those words sound vaguely familiar, especially verse 35.
Because mine says even like, and when he said these things, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat.
Yeah, it's basically what it says.
So yeah, it's communion.
Right. This is communion. Gave thanks, Eucharistos, Eucharist. So where we get that term Eucharist from, right? The Eucharist, Eucharistos, the Eucharist, to give thanks. Okay, from what Christ does at the Last Supper, right? As with the words of institution, when we partake of Holy Communion, right, or the Eucharist, same thing.
So would he have given that to all of them, even the non-Christians?
No. So this is where this is why you need to kind of read it through as the text flows,
Sorry.
right? So he himself gives thanks for it, right? He blesses it, etc. He, and you can presume Luke and Aristarchus, right? They partake of communion. There's then the bread that's been blessed, and he then gives. It's like you can think of it almost in a similar vein, I suppose, almost like to the feeding of the 5,000 in one sense, almost. It's not exactly the same, but it's kind of it broadly parallels it in many respects, at least. The actual essence of what Christ was doing with the feeding of the 5,000 was, this is the bread of life, right? That's where you get all that stuff tied in. It's just after he feeds the 5,000, for example, that he then goes into this whole explanation of I am the bread of life. Unless one eats my body and drinks my blood, he will not have eternal life, right? All these things which are feeding into like Eucharistic theology, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So it's in that same, that's what I'm trying to draw a comparison to. It's in that similar vein, right? And so this is not in the context of a liturgical service or anything else like that, right? It's not like it's in a worship. So again, there's a categorical difference, but it's shadowing it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
That's why that wording is so in verse 35 is so utterly familiar, right? Having said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. Is like very, very similar to the wording of the way that the Last Supper. I'm fairly certain Luke has the Last Supper in his. I'll have to look. Yeah, he does. Yeah, Luke chapter 22 has the Last Supper, right? So the very same guy who wrote about the Last Supper is also here live and writing about this. And the wording, I'll actually go and see if I can, how Luke phrases it in Luke 22. I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants, but that's all right.
That would have been pretty seasick too. I mean, it's not
Oh yeah. He
Well,
would
yeah, of
feel
course,
like-
obviously.
sailors, but in that sort of a...
Yeah, that would do. Yeah, that correct. Yes.
Dehydrated.
Wouldn't be well, would you?
Yeah, would be in great shape.
See, it's-
No, exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's going
Possible drowning,
to Luke 22.
not feeling like eating, not getting enough to drink. Yeah, no thanks. That's a holiday cruise I don't think I'll take.
Yeah. So the way that Luke phrases it is very, very similar. In Luke chapter 22, verses 17 about the cup, verse 19 about the bread, especially verse 19 about the bread. When he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. It's Acts 27, verse 35. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat.
Yeah.
Right? It's very, very similar. Like I'm saying, they're not identical. I'm not claiming they're identical. I'm saying I'm talking about parallels,
Yeah.
right? Foreshadowing of things, right? And all of them became cheerful, right? So it completely changed their entire outlook, their entire attitude on this, right? It brought joy to their hearts. And they themselves took some of the food, right? And all of us in the ship were 276 76 people. Psyche, right? Sold or psyche. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. Okay? So they continued to lighten the ship, but they were now, the storm had now broken. This ship is very badly damaged, but we'll look at that in the next lesson, right? And they're running aground on shore. But yes, there's a whole host of things. Now, this is where we get to the ending of the details of this passage, but let's now cover some of these meta-narrative points. This whole ordeal is, in one respect, as I said to you, there are a number of allegorical or symbolic principles that are playing out here, right? Which is often how God operates. He communicates through symbolism very often, right? Not that are vague or abstract, but rather that are tangible, right? The proverbial theatre of life, as one might say. We see this, right? So if you looked at, I'll use actually a pretty comparable example, not to the same degree, but a similar, a broadly analogous circumstance of the flood. In that context, you have a great ship that saves the people in it amidst the waters of chaos. Okay. This is why reading the Bible like the original audience would have is one of the most effective ways for understanding what's being said. Now, the only way you're able to do that is by learning the Bible, learning history, having that working together, right? But then again, that's how you would learn anything, right? We run into 1,000 problems, as do people at any time period, when they find themselves, whether they realise it or not, in misinterpretations of what's being said because they're reading it through the lens of themselves. Okay, that's been no more the how would you phrase it? The risk of that has been no greater than it is today, right? For a variety of reasons, but the foremost of which is the fact that our society, just in general, modern Western society, is orders of magnitude different than any society 2,000 plus years ago, right? From economics, technology, politics, pick a thing, right? There's plenty of similarities, okay? But 1,000 years ago in, say, medieval England, for example, they had much more in common with the first century than we do with either of those two. It's why, for example, talk about the 9th century, when King Alfred of Wessex, who would go on to become essentially the first king of England, is writing his Doom book, in other words, his law code. Doom meant law in Old English. Many, in fact, dozens of the laws of Deuteronomy and other such places, he's able to just literally quote directly straight into it, because medieval England is an agrarian society, much like ancient Israel was. Right? Many of those laws are just completely transferable because they're exactly the same in regards to their agrarian farmlands and peasantry and a whole host of things. Many of those things are much different today, so directly just translating things straight out of Deuteronomy would require work, not just directly bringing it in. Right? So those kinds of disconnects can cause problems, and I could be here all day listing the kind of practical ways in which that ends up playing out. But the time period in which you live invariably shapes your worldview, the aim should be to make sure it shapes it as little as possible. Not even necessarily because some of the things are inherently bad, some are, but most are not. It's just a matter of how those things impact the lens through which you read something, right? Everyone always is going to have some element of subjectivity or bias because we're not perfectly objective beings, right? That just has to be accepted. However, the aim should be to strive for the most amount of objectivity and by consequence the least amount of bias as possible, right? Because truth is objective, and if you're striving to follow the one who is the way, the truth and the life, you will inevitably attempt to work yourself closer and closer to that kind of objectivity. Accepting that you'll never achieve it in this mortal life, that's okay, right? And when you do, and when there is elements of bias, make sure that you hopefully have the wisdom, you've learnt the wisdom to be able to correct that and to be able to notice that in the first place and go, okay, now that's just my subjective opinion. That's not actually objectively true, whatever. Having laid that groundwork, the temptation here is to read this entire portion of the storm on the Mediterranean Sea as just from a purely analytical perspective, and here's all the neat little details, and the wind came down from here, and then they sailed from here to here, and you're just reading it for the detailed points without understanding how all of these elements actually have deep symbolic meaning, okay? And I'll make one final groundwork point before I then explain what these points are. This is the inevitable problem that exists as well in certainly large portions of Western evangelical churches, is that faithfulness to the scriptures is far too often equated with taking a literal reading. Okay? Everything that happened here happened. Okay, this happened. This absolutely happened. This is historical narrative. There's nothing confusing about that, and no one's denying that, least of all me. Okay, so everything you see here actually happened. When it says, and when the 14th night came, it actually was the 14th night. It wasn't. It's not just purely symbolic. Okay, this actually was. When they say that it was 20 fathoms deep and then it became 15, that actually happened. Right? That's not the point. What happens is that because there are at times those who use symbolism or allegory to just write off any of this as being historically true, the pendulum swing in the opposite direction happens, where being faithful to the scriptures or believing that the scriptures are true is equated with taking a literal reading at all times. Okay? And what it does is it misses and just flat out actually not just ignores but rejects. It doesn't just ignore it, actively rejects massive amounts of the symbolic value even in historical narrative. Okay? Knowing the flood actually happened, it's deeply symbolic. They're not; those two things are not mutually exclusive. Okay, and the reason why we know it's deeply symbolic is because that's exactly how the apostles treated it, right? Especially the apostle Peter. The flood of Noah, yes, right. He talks about how that was a type, right, and an antitype, to use his terminology, right, a foreshadowing of, and something that carried great symbolic value for Christ and his redemption, right? The redemption he would bring. That Christ is the ark, the church is the ark, Christ's body, right? And we're saved in it from the judgment. That's what Peter goes at lengths to explain that, right? So it's something real that happened that actually carries with it much deeper and much more important symbolic value and meaning, right? And so it's not just done for historical tidbits, or it's not just written for historical facts, so that you can have details in your head.
It's
right?
not like a history book.
Even though it is, right?
But it's not only.
It's more than that. Yes, right.
Yeah, much more.
But we look at it in that it's a book that teaches us. So everything, you read all that. Well, what are we learning from that? Like, what is God trying to teach us?
Yes, right. Exactly, correct.
That's where
And this is the thing: is that what happens is that
and you get the reverse though too. You get people that go, "Oh, the whole thing's just symbolic." And
that was my point earlier, right?
Yeah.
So because there are some who use, especially those who are kind of really actively trying to actually undermine the Christian religion, right? They either used to be Christians or they're not Christians at all. That's usually out of it. always goes. What they mean by symbolic is this is all just fairy tales. And even then, again, the way we use the term fairy tales, see, all the people who originally wrote fairy tales and talked about them didn't believe they were just pie in the sky. So even the way we now use the word fairy tale is proof positive of exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. Same with the term mythos, that Greek term. When we use the term myth, we mean absolutely made up, 0% fact, the whole thing's a load of baloney. That's what we generally mean. Except what happens is in academia, that's not how we use the term mythos, right? There's a spectrum of what that word means, which again might take much more time to explain. But mythos does not equate in a technical sense to untrue. It never did in Greek, and in academic circles where it's used, absolutely. And so how that word gets used is just difficult because of the original way it was used in Greek, how it gets used in academia, which has knowledge of how that was used, and then that's much different than how it gets used in what we call popular usage. In other words, common everyday usage, right? In popular usage, myth means completely made up and has no basis in fact, whereas that's never what that word ever meant, right? Just like fairy tale. But that's getting back to the point. The point is that ironically what happens is that when both of those extremes, so the symbolic equaling it's all just made up stories to teach some moral point, whatever that happens to be, right? Which is not the biblical view. Right? It's not the view of the Bible of itself. Or the other end of that pendulum, which is reducing and eliminating or rejecting the vast majority, if not all, of the symbolic elements. Ironically, they both become Gnostic in completely the opposite way. Very few people would have thought of this, and that's okay, right? On the one hand, this over this side, purely symbologizing or allegorizing or spiritualizing these texts of any kind, treats the actual, real, tangible, material history of the world as something that has no inherent meaning or value, has no purpose, and that really it's only the symbolic spiritual value that matters. It's a very Gnostic idea. On the other end, completely unintentionally, they end up falling into the exact same concept, just in the opposite direction, which is only these material details matter, not the symbolic, and so it's actually a rejection of the symbolic. It's like Gnosticism just in the complete opposite direction, and it denies the spiritual elements. It actually becomes atheistic. Because you're denying the symbolic elements. You're denying that those things are actually real at all. You're denying that there's any symbolic or allegorical meaning to the universe. That there's nothing beyond the tangible factoids of life. So ironically, in trying to defend against a legitimate issue, people symbologizing and hyper allegorizing something, you end up falling into error. Now, who was here for church history on Sunday? You're all here. Okay. Remember
Were you here, Dave?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Remember I mentioned a figure, Eutyches of Constantinople, or Eutyches, who I said he was going to become relevant in the next council?
Yeah.
This is exactly what happened with him. Staunch defender of the truth at Ephesus, who ends up falling into heresy because he does this giant pendulum swing in trying to fight against Nestorianism. He ends up teaching a brand new heresy himself. This is the exact problem I'm talking about. You always hear me use this term being balanced, right? And I use this like an analogy of a horse, right? You don't want to fall off the horse this way, and you also don't want to fall off that way. Just stay on the horse, right? If you try and overcompensate, again, car crashes. Plenty of car crashes happen because what happens? So they hit a ditch of water, or they're going around a corner too fast, and the driver does what? They oversteer. They overcorrect, and that causes them to spin out into a tree. They overcorrect. That's what causes the crash so many times, like heaps of times. Crashes are caused by oversteering and overcorrecting. Instead of, they slam the brake, which they shouldn't do because they're going through the water anyway, so now you're gliding, and they oversteer and they spin out. right? So they completely overreact, and that causes, where if they didn't overreact, if they just went off the brake, or off the accelerator rather,
Goes sliding through.
yep, or go slowly through in the first place, yes. But if they realise something's happening, right, and they don't overreact, they would have been fine. It's because they overreact. And so this happens. We can do this all the time with intellectual things. The overreaction can even be as bad or even worse as the initial problem itself, right? So when you eliminate the very deep symbolic values and principles which are weaving their way all throughout the scripture.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
then they can't hit the Old Testament.
Thank you. This is about...
There's just no,
Sure.
the
Yeah.
threat, right?
Correct. That's exactly what I was about to say next. Yes, correct. Is that this is why then in our time we struggle so greatly in many instances in my experience to understand New Testament text, because we don't actually get the Old Testament first, right? So all of those things in the ritual laws of Leviticus, like I pointed out to you the other day when you asked me about Leviticus
I'm reading Leviticus. So
11 or
isn't it
12
funny
or
how-
whatever.
Yeah, I'm into Leviticus at the moment. Yeah.
You're asking me about why on earth did the birth of a boy make the mother
Yeah.
unclean for 7 days versus the
14.
for 14?
Yeah.
And I explained to you that it had to do with the fact that. Why don't we pull it up? Because this actually makes my point that I can then transition into the meta-narrative for this. Turn to Leviticus for me, because I can at least make this point. Because Lisa and I know what we're talking about, but you may not be understand what I'm referencing. Leviticus, wherever it is, 11 or 12, whatever you're showing me.
12 purification.
After childbirth, it is.
12.
Where it is Day of Atonement. Oh yeah, purification after childbirth.
Sure. Whereabouts is it?
12.
Okay, well, there you go. Which portion were you reading specifically again? Just remind
That
me.
whole thing I was
Right,
reading.
yeah.
It goes through the...
Yep. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the opening verses. Anyway. Speak to the sons of Israel, verse 2, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, she shall be unclean for 7 days, and in the days of menstruation she shall be unclean. And then goes on talking about that. And then it compares that to the daughter for 2 weeks, so verse 5, right? Female child should be unclean, in other words, 14 days. So again, a feminist or an egalitarian reading of this would have one question: this must be unfair, and that God is somehow a sexist. The point that I made to you was that no, the whole notion of ritual uncleanliness, or being as having a ritual spiritual status of being ritually unclean, was for these very same symbolic values of the demonstration of the curse of sin and how it pervades into all sectors of human life in our existence, and that these things tie into the curse that came about as a result of the fall. And these were the vivid, continuous demonstrations and reminders and symbols of that effect, right? God promises, it is a promise. God curses in this case. God curses the various figures of the fall, the serpent one way, the man the other way. But in regards to Eve, you shall give pain in childbirth, right? Why? By virtue of the fact that you're having been deceived and then led your husband in that deception and usurped authority, etc., etc., etc. There will now be a vivid reminder of the curse that you've now brought upon, and that will be demonstrated in the very thing which is meant to produce life, will actually be a painful process. When it should otherwise be a joyful and peaceful process, it will now be painful and filled with hardship, right? And man will, and which is the most, like, the core essence of the struggle of man in the world. When I say man, I mean like humanity, right? Man's life will now be a struggle. It won't be peaceful and bliss. It will be marked by struggle. It will be marked by turmoil. It will be marked by fighting against chaos, and it will be marked by death, right? As a result of your actions. And so again, those things are the reminders. So that plays out there, and it plays out there because of exactly actually the text that principle we happen to touch on on Sunday. That man was formed first, then Eve, but but Adam himself was not deceived, but rather Eve, being deceived, fell into sin, right? Adam was ultimately responsible. The scriptures go to ad infinitum to explain that. a cursory reading through Romans is all about how Adam screwed up big time. Eve's not even really mentioned. But Eve was the one who was deceived, right? So what's showing is it's actually hearkening back to, especially in the context of childbirth, it's hearkening back to the fall, how that played out, the curse, and so it's this vivid reminder, right? And all of this, not even for its own right, but rather to point toward the need for redemption. Okay? So that little instance, this one little portion of Leviticus, I mean, it's all the other portions of the ritual customary law. And again, all that's been fulfilled now in Christ, because now we have been ultimately cleansed by Christ's blood, right? It's why you get these odd references in the New Testament in Paul to women being saved through, this one time he references about women being saved through childbirth, and usually people are like, what the hell does that mean? That's as a demonstration of the reversal of the curse, right? Women being saved through childbirth. In other words, meaning you were meant to be fruitful and multiply, and you were meant to be obedient. All that came with that, right? Dominion, mandate, blah, blah, blah. That now became cursed as a result of you, Adam and Eve, right? But we're talking about here Eve in this case, right? Now, however, in the new covenant, now as a result of the atonement, as redemption, as the curse is being undone in the world, just as which Christmas carol is it? I can sing the lyrics and I can't remember the incipit that gets the name. Joy to the World.
Oh yeah.
Far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found.
I didn't know that was in that song.
Well, it is.
One of the verses in.
Yeah?
Yep.
I did not know.
Far as the curse is found.
Sing all the verses you get to.
Yep.
I love that hymn, but I don't remember. I haven't.
That's what one of the verses finished on, right? It's talking about the undoing of the curse, right? As the kingdom of God expands to the world, right? Very personal. But that's that whole notion that ties up in that carol, right? As far as the curse is found. In other words, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, right? The kingdom of Christ, expanding through the world as far as the curse is found, right? Until the curse is entirely undone, right? That's that whole notion, okay? So all those little things are playing out symbolically in what seems like just some little thing of why on earth, no. When you understand how this theme has been playing out through the Old Testament, this becomes very straightforward. But see, if you've dumped and eliminated the symbolic values, good luck getting that passage. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
I didn't think God was being sexist. I just thought.
Oh no, I'm saying, but that's the only thing we have to fall back on is just that this must be some arbitrary. No, it's not arbitrary at all.
Yeah, there must be a reason.
No, there's actually important. Exactly, and so what that was a constant reminder. Men and women are different. Men and women had different sins, that they had different roles in the fall.
They atoned differently.
Perhaps. Yep, they had different roles in the fall, right?
Yep.
Right, so one was deceived, one wasn't deceived, but one was ultimately responsible, one was not ultimately responsible, right? So it went both ways, right? But ultimately, it's pointing back to the fall and pointing forward to the need to fix the fall, right? All those things. And we could talk about like that all day, right? But in Christ, the reason why those ritual elements have been fulfilled, not abolished, again, Christ hasn't abolished the law, he's fulfilled the elements, he's fulfilled all the law, right? And there are different categories of the law, the customary or ritual laws as we call them, which are what Leviticus is largely dealing with, is fulfilled in the atonement, in that cleansing, right? That sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. So we're now entirely in a state of ritual cleanliness, right? Which is part of the problem with the Roman Catholic conceptualization of venial sins and mortal sins and falling in and out of a state of grace, but that's another issue altogether.
Yeah. Lou. I've got to go to the loo. Sorry,
That's okay. Grab the keys. It's all right.
You know where the key is? Hanging on the hook.
Up here? Oh, yeah, here.
Over there. Yep. So yes.
You can keep going, I can catch up.
Okay, cool. That's right. So the meta-narrative points. What you have in the meta-narrative, what's going on in this story is you have in this case 276 persons, including obviously you'd assume Paul and co, on a ship, travelling through deep waters, which in no uncertain terms can be described as chaotic, right? They're chaotic waters. Yes, make sure that's unlocked, yes. Chaotic waters, right? Throughout the history of the world, until again we largely dumped a lot of these symbolic values in our conceptualization of things, the sea has always been associated with chaos, whereas the land has been associated with order, right? There are some very obvious prima facie reasons for this. The land is stable, the waters are continuously in motion, right? So the difference between stability and motion, order, chaos, that's the symbolic value, as well as the fact that man can't live at sea. We can't, right? Now we can gerrymander that with technology on the ship, right? So you could hypothetically set up really what you're doing is actually setting up a scientific laboratory, and you'd be growing food in a hydroponic setting, and you'd be doing this, and you'd be, growing food on the ship and blah, 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 blah. But outside of that gerrymandering, that's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to any other time. I'm referring to any other as a general essence, man doesn't live on the water, right? Man lives on the land, right? So the only things that exist out on the water is death and things that can kill you. Sharks, right? Or, different types of, carnivorous things like, so various different types of sharks, squids, especially like giant squids, stingrays, etc. The waters itself, right? It's deep, it's dark. There's no, it's an abyss in its own right. There's no, there is literally a bottom, but you have no way of getting to it. So it in that sense, in terms of the human perception, it's just an abyss that goes on forever. That's why the waters of the abyss is often referred to. You get that reference in Genesis and elsewhere, right? So all of these things, they're very obvious, right? The symbolic value of what's implied there. The waters have always symbolized chaos and the land order. And so throughout the Old Testament, that's kind of also applied to the distinction between God's people and the Gentiles, right? The pagans around them, right? The God's people in the Old Testament are often equated with the land, the Eretz, and then the Gentiles around them are equated with the sea, especially because the seas are so massive and voluminous compared to the land as far as you perceive it, right? There are way more of them than there are of us. That's the perception in the Old Testament, right? The Israelites, by comparison, often being a much smaller nation than their people around them, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Pardon me. So, consequently, this distinction between the earth as order and the waters as chaos, which is exactly what those references are the way back in Genesis, right? The waters above, the waters below, right? The Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep, that's exactly what that is, right? And it's this chaos that God then orders. So you have that playing out here, okay? Except they're in a chaotic environment, and quite literally, right? The storm, etc. That's all those things that we're saying. There is no life from a human perspective. There's only death out on the high seas. You can't live out there. You can't build cities out there. You can't march armies out there. You can't grow food out there. There's only the waters which you'll drown in, the winds and the storms which will toss you overboard and shipwreck you, and then the creatures of the deep which will devour you. Right? The waters are chaos. Okay? Always have been. Always have that symbolic value. So here they are in the midst of chaos, right? On a ship that's barely hanging on. These guys they're on a ship that they have blessed, that they have carried with them the blessing of Poseidon, the blessing of Zeus, the blessing of other figures as well, but similarly, at least Poseidon and Zeus, or in other words, Neptune and Jupiter. They've done the necessary little things, the votive offerings and prayers and sacrifices that they needed to do, and that they were told to do, that this would secure you safe journeys across the seas, because these are the guys who are in charge of it. This is all going awry. So evidently it either didn't work, or Poseidon and Zeus are offended at something we didn't do it the right way, or we messed up the words, or the sacrifice wasn't good enough, or some other pitiful excuse as to why Poseidon and Zeus have now turned on us. Okay? This is the thought process behind what they're going for. They're praying and it's not working, and so eventually some of them decide to try and abandon ship out of sheer fear and panic. Blah 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 blah. However, fortunately for these Greco-Roman pagans, there's a group of Christians on board. Okay, and these Christians actually have a direct line to the only person who's actually in charge of any of this stuff, and he's already told them, in this case him, Paul, that not only will the Christians be saved, but God will actually bless all those who the Christians are with, and they will be saved too. Okay. He then tells them this. Certainly the Roman soldiers believe. The others also eventually come around, and they come around when they get a demonstration of the Eucharist, of communion, which itself, of course, is obviously is itself heavily symbolic, whilst also actually being much more than just a symbol. Okay, it carries with it the great symbolic weight of the body and the blood, but it also actually is the body and the blood, not in a substantive sense, because that is a novel accretion of the medieval period, especially in Rome. But Christ is truly present in and through communion, especially from a spiritual perspective, but not spiritual in the sense that it's detached. It's through those material elements, because God works through the material world. If he didn't, he wouldn't have created it in the first place. Right? So they have this vivid demonstration of one of the single most powerful elements and symbols in all of the Christian religion. And this inspires in them confidence, because really what they're actually witnessing is the material demonstration, which is exactly what Holy Communion is, the material demonstration of the sacrifice of Christ. And it's through that material demonstration, in other words, the elements, in which the grace of that sacrifice is applied to us. Again, it doesn't just happen abstractly, because that's the irony of the symbolic view of communion, is that it turns communion into a very Gnostic thing, where God administers his grace just arbitrarily and completely disconnected from material means, which is not how we ever see him operating in Scripture. If God, with regards to God redeeming his people and cleansing them of their sin and forgiving them of their sins, he doesn't just wave a wand in heaven and just declare it. No, sacrifice must be made. Right? There must be atonement. And so God comes in the flesh. The spiritual and the material are not enemies of each other, they're actually united to each other. Right? That's what gets lost, and that's why the early church universally believed in the real presence of Christ in communion, because the spiritual and the material are not disconnected. Christ, in other words, God doesn't just abstractly decide to apply grace. It doesn't just happen in this completely detached abstract sense that no one can actually define anyway. It happens through communion. That's why everyone suffered when churches shut down for 6 months in 2021, because people weren't taking communion for 6 months. And I said that. I said that to people. I said quite frankly, I said the reason why you're all so desperate to get back to church, and why your lives are actually worse now after 6 months. Which I'm not even saying like people are like, oh, things haven't gone well for me in the last 6 months. Yeah, because you haven't taken communion, because of these factors of these people who kept you away from communion. Yes, the denial of people from partaking of communion is something that will be punished with fury that can scarcely be imagined, but that's another issue. So to get back to this point, they get this vivid demonstration of the sacrifice of Christ, right? The very one who, by the way, walked upon the waters and calmed the storm, who then calms the storm. Notice that it's the day was about to dawn, and when do we see the storm break? It's when Paul takes communion. It wasn't on day, you know what I'm saying? It's after that 14 day. It's not back in day 3. It's not that blah, blah. Like we kind of go from, we get the first 3 days and then we jump to day 14, right? Or night 14 actually, and we're through the night and then into as it's about to dawn. And again, also then, by the way, the symbolic value, it's just about to dawn, right? The light's about to come, right? They haven't seen the sun, the moon, the stars for 3 days, in those first 3 days, right? So they can't navigate, there's no direction, right? Because you navigate by the stars, right? You measure the time, the sun, there's the sun, blah, 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 right? It's so, like, clouds everywhere, storms, it's overcast, all that kind of stuff. They're completely they're in the very essence of chaos. They can't even use the stars to navigate, right? So they're directionless, in the bottomless pit of the abyss, the seas, surrounded by chaos and storm, right? The symbolic value of all that is just, you know what I'm saying? That's why I said, like, tongue in cheek at the very beginning, like, this reads like a medieval folk tale about epic legends of old who have done this journey and they're traveling through this. Like, this reads like the Odyssey, actually, if I'm being honest with you. This reads like Homer's Odyssey, of his 20-year journey back from the Trojan War. The Odyssey is like the sequel, is essentially the sequel to the Iliad. Right, so the Iliad, the Trojan War that Homer writes, the ancient epic Greek poet from the 8th century BC, and King Odysseus, right, or Odysseus, one of those leaders of the Greeks. The Odyssey is then the sequel to the Iliad, where his journey back to Ithaca is this great mythical epic journey and he gets trapped on an island and he gets captured and he gets involved. There's a whole host of things that go on. Anyway, it reads much like this. But that's because God operates through material means. Again, because the material and the spiritual are not at enmity with one another. That's the Gnostic era, right? And also the atheistic era in the opposite direction, right? Atheism is just the antithesis of Gnosticism. That's all it is. Gnosticism demeans the material in favour of the spiritual, and atheism just does the opposite thing. It demeans the spiritual in favour of the material, right? Exact same dynamic, like same dichotomy, same dynamic, just the opposite ends of the spectrum, which ultimately, ironically, makes them united, in one sense at least. So all of these things, and yes, and then it's the visible demonstration of the sacrifice of Christ, the Eucharist, which then just before, as that wording in verse 33, until the day was about to dawn, which also happened to be the time which Christ rose from the dead as well, by the way, but that's another issue altogether. As the day was about to dawn, as the sun was about to rise, just as the sun did rise, as the light that dawned upon the earth, vis-a-vis Isaiah 9, vis-a-vis 1,000 other places in the scriptures, and this visible demonstration of that sacrifice of the light who did dawn upon the world, breaks the storm and calms things and brings joy back and encourages them and fills them with joy again, because they'd been in the pit of despair itself, right? So that they themselves had been in the abyss of despair. It's all these things. It's so shockingly replete. And this is what happens when you don't value symbolic truth. Is this text becomes just filler, right? This text just becomes Luke padding out the details of this journey, and you just go, oh, there's some nice, interesting little historical tidbits. This text, and pardon the pun, is so drowning in symbolic truth, I could be here all day. Okay? The only thing that saves them through this, Poseidon doesn't save them, Zeus doesn't save them, their prayers don't save them, none of those things. The only thing that saves them is the sovereignty of God, of the true God whom Paul serves, right? Who he mentions, right?
He shows them grace by saving them.
And shows them grace. And the only reason that any of those other guys are saved, of the crew and the soldiers, right? There's a hodgepodge of people here, right? The only reason the Roman troops or the ship's crew themselves are saved is because of God's grace through the Christians. So this bread is for your salvation. This food is for your salvation. Double entendre. In the one sense, because you've been starving for days on end, so it's for your salvation. But also pointing symbolically, this food is for your salvation, because he's taking communion. This food is for your salvation. He's pointing towards the sacrifice of Christ, right? Yeah. In the Eucharist, which is what they're doing, which is what he's doing there, right? He and Luke and Aristarchus, right? So salvation comes through the Christians to the pagans. and the pagans are then the pagans then rejoice in the Eucharist and in the food that's then left over from that, right? Blah, blah, blah. And they're saved through that, which is exactly how the kingdom of God spreads. As the Christians are sent out and go forth, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and disciple all the nations. All right? Blah, 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 blah.
And it's God that saved them, not the Christians.
Okay, that's why I said the operative word is through. The operative word is through, yeah.
That's exactly
Through, yes. Again, the consistent wording on Paul's part. I'm finding the exact wording where he says it.
And that whole thing is all about
verse 23, yeah. Yeah, correct. Verse 23, verse 23. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me saying, do not be afraid, Paul, for you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you that all those who are sailing with you... Sorry, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Right. So they will be saved on your account. I will save them through you. Right? So the sovereignty of God is what saves them, because God was the one who was sovereign over the storm, not Poseidon, not this. So again, it's very eerily reminiscent of exactly what occurs in the Exodus, right? The pagan gods being shown to be ultimately powerless compared to God. Okay, that's the whole point of the 10 plagues. Okay, the turning of the Nile to blood, plague of frogs, locusts, blah, etc., storms, blah, blah. None of these deities of the Egyptian pantheon who actually presided over those things had the power to stop the God of the Hebrews from doing whatever he wanted to those various things. The offerings they would have made to Poseidon and to Zeus and to others did nothing. If anything, I can guarantee you for a fact that they thought that they must have done it wrong. Somehow they've offended the gods. This is the way. This is the.
They wouldn't lose faith in their gods.
No.
They think it's them.
No, they think it's them. But that's the enslavement of. This is a tale as old as time. This is exactly why paganism is so pernicious and always has been. Because at the end of the day, what ends up happening is when things go wrong, we must have done something to tick off whichever god's responsible for this field, right? And at the same time, you actually don't know that because it's entirely possible you did everything right and that god is ticked off about something anyway.
Yeah, because it's a whim.
It's completely capricious and arbitrary. It's entirely possible that Poseidon is just bored.
Yeah.
It's also entirely possible. It's also entirely possible that some other god, one of the other gods, insulted Poseidon, and now Poseidon is demonstrating his power, and he doesn't care about the collateral damage. It's also possible. Absolutely, those are very staple elements of Greek mythology, and that's not just Greece. I'm just talking about this example, right? This is very, very common. The gods of the pagan pantheons are shockingly arbitrary and capricious.
What about the ones from
especially the
Odin
Greeks
and all of that group?
So Norse, yeah. So Odin, Thor, a bit different. They're less arbitrary in the stories that get told. The vast preponderance of what we have with regards to the Germanic gods, Odin, Thor, Frigg, even Loki, the trickster deity, they get kind of written through the Eddas, as they're called, Edda, Eddas, the Icelandic Eddas especially. So these are prose, poetic stories that get transmitted through particularly Iceland, right, coming via Norway, but we're talking like 11th, 12th centuries, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries AD, right, during the Viking Age and afterwards. And these stories, I mean, look, as a whole, again, I'm very, very familiar with both of these different pantheons. The Norse or the Germanic pantheon more generally they're less, I would argue at least they're less arbitrary than the Greek and Roman. But they still, again, and they're slightly different in their makeup as well. some of the stories about them are slightly different, so there's reasons that impact that without regaling as to what they all are. But there are elements of, but again, at the end of the day, there are still elements, especially when it comes to things like collateral damage. There's significant divisiveness between portions of the Norse gods and other portions. So for starters, there's two different races, the Aesir and the Vanir, which creates a very interesting dynamic. These are considered to be like two different races of gods. There is then also this dynamic of this figure Loki, who is a malevolent figure. There's a whole story as to why that occurs, etc., etc., which I won't take much more time. And that creates problems when Odin is interacting with interacting with Loki or other such figures as well. Again, every one of the gods has a different personality. They have different dynamics. They have a different way of handling things. Some handle things surreptitiously and quietly. Others handle things ostentatiously and violently. I'm saying to you, there's all these things. They're extremely human figures in regards to how they act and behave, which is the entirely seminal difference with regards to when it comes to God, because God is not a man, in his divinity. He's entirely other. The second person of the Trinity, Jesus, has taken on human flesh. He is a human now, but he's also divine. I'm talking about the divine. I'm talking about God, the divinity, right? He's not man. That's what's entirely different. Whereas the pagan gods are shockingly human.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing I've always, and I saw this from a young Christian guy. Basically, the idea that Christianity is it's. I think God has made it so that it's accessible for everyone. It doesn't have to. You don't have to be an academic.
No, not at all.
Because all these gods that we've been talking about, they're so complicated, and it's so.
That's why I said half of it is like I could explain all this to, because that's my.
And they've all got, you've got the what are they, the three deities all arguing about who's the best looking chickie babe, and then the apple gets thrown in or something. I've forgotten all of that, and someone,
Sure, yes.
all of that business, and they're all having these arguments. So you've got to keep track of who's.
Sure, there's a
who's
dispute.
Who,
there's a dispute between Athena, Artemis, and Aphrodite.
And all this stuff. And you just think, the Bible, you can, like you were demonstrating before, like with all the symbolism just in that one part of the Bible, and you can connect it back to the Old Testament, and it's just like endlessly connecting things, but the basic principle is simple. It's basically, to be a Christian, to know who God is it comes through accepting Jesus Christ for who he said he was, and asking for forgiveness of sins. It's pretty, but for some people, they can't kind of get over this whole idea of, I've got to admit that I'm sinful. Oh, well, that's not right. And then my response to that is, well, so you're saying you're perfect? No. Well, then what are you saying?
What are you saying?
Because that's kind of what we're talking about. The only perfect.
What they're saying is, well, no one's perfect, but I'm not as bad as the next person. Yeah. And so I'm fine. That's what they meant. Yeah. And so that's what. But what that does is, all of those things at the end of the day are smoke screens for eliminating moral culpability. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
So but I don't think God makes it. For some people, because I've known people, especially working in disabilities, where people academically, and even myself, I'm not academically inclined myself, but for people, this is for everyone. It's for people that are incredibly scientific. It's for and have a real academic brain, but it's also for those that have other sorts of intelligence, artistic intelligence, or social intelligence.
That's all true. Scholars, theologians like myself can spend their entire life and not reach a tenth of the way through the depth and complexity.
Yeah.
and at the same time, children understand the gospel.
Yeah, they do. They do. I mean, I remember I was thinking back about how
That should also be expected, by the way, from a philosophical perspective, because if it is genuinely the word of God, you should expect, so God himself is infinitely macroscopic and microscopic. So the same God who transcends time and space and matter is also the God who, on a very technical sense, is omnipresent at the subatomic level. So infinitely macroscopic, infinitely microscopic, and you get that same dynamic play out in the word, where, like I said, theologians can plumb the depths of it, to use that analogy, throughout their life, and they still will not get to the end. Whereas, and the other end is that children can understand the gospel. So it actually reflects the metaphysical nature. The word of God actually reflects the metaphysical nature of the God whose word it supposedly is, which makes sense. And like you mentioned about connections, so the hyperlinked nature of the scriptures, in other words, its connectivity, right, is utterly unique. And like, not even just like in a preferential sense, I mean in a genuinely objective sense, it's utterly unique. There's nothing that comes even vaguely close. And I'm not even saying this, again, I'm not even saying this hyperbolically, I'm saying this from a true metaphysical or philosophical statement. That hyperlinked nature is technically infinite. So what I mean by hyperlinked, what I mean is you can start at one portion, let's say Genesis 1:1, read through X amount and come upon another part of the scriptures that references that, either directly or indirectly. So in other words, either by quotation or by like the same concept or principle, whatever it is, right? Blah, blah. You jump to that, and you then can read through, and it now connects to another portion. You can do that on a technical level in an infinite number of ways, mathematically speaking. So even, and this might seem philosophically complex, but the reason why it seems philosophically complex is because it actually technically is philosophically complex, which is not, again, shouldn't be surprising when we're talking about God. But the fact that that these hyperlinks between the texts are mathematically infinite also is something that reflects the nature. It also attests to its nature of being the word of God, right? So you've got the macroscopic, microscopic distinction, right? So God is infinitely macroscopic and infinitely microscopic, right? Beyond space and time, also creates the infinitudes of the subatomic world, right? We, therefore, when we read the word of God, theologians can study their entire life and not even cover 10% of its depth, yet also the gospel can be understood by a child. So that's reflected, but then my point then is about the hyperlinked nature, going from passage to passage to passage through direct or indirect reference or quotation or whichever category you're talking about. That hyperlinked nature is mathematically infinite. You can start and go to another portion, or you can start at this portion, go to this portion. So the mathematical way you can go through it is infinite from a mathematical perspective, which is unique to literature. There is nothing else that has that.
Patterns within it.
There's nothing. That's what I mean. There's nothing else in human literature that's ever been written that even vaguely comes close to that, right? And that's not, when I say infinite, like I said earlier, it's not. I'm not just saying it like to mean a big number. No, it's mathematically infinite. And there is nothing else in human. There is nothing else in human literature that is actually like that.
It's phenomenal. And
which is all of that points towards its
divinity. Yeah,
it's divine inspiration.
Yeah, because even myself, like.
Otherwise, how on earth do you explain that?
Yeah, like it is, like you know, just looking at the connection, because it was only since I've started here that whole idea of connecting things and then seeing, oh, right, you're here. Oh, yeah, but I remember seeing it back there. Even on a very, like in my case, very surface level, you know, you can get that. But I think that's what is, to me, all that points to how God, he always comes to us. Like we never, we think we go to him, or we put ourselves on pedestals, so we try to get closer to him or whatnot. But It's only him coming to us, like Christ coming down to earth. It's always him having to, and it's so profound and it's so humbling that he comes to us. And even through the word, even through his word, he meets us where we are. So even if you are someone that, like a child, or thinks is an adult but thinks like a child, you can still know God in his fullness anyway.
Because God reveals the scriptures to us as we're reading when we're, as part of our sanctification. But the other thing that I think has been neglected in modern times is the lack of teaching.
Totally. Yep.
Until
Well,
So this, yeah.
so
that
true.
solid teaching,
Yeah.
we're always going to be reading it like children.
So this touches
I agree,
This
I
touches
agree.
on an important point again.
I
So these
totally
things
agree
are
with that.
So these things are. It's much like when we talk about symbolism. What happens is when you cast off philosophy, right? Especially things like metaphysics. So in other words, speaking to the metaphysics, the philosophy of nature, of reality, like what is real, what is being, what is existence. Like these very obviously, that should be obvious how the scriptures talk about metaphysical things, right? It's much like my comment earlier about God's operation through material means. So, like when we talked about with Holy Communion, one's knowledge of God doesn't just magically increase through some completely isolated means of God just kind of downloading information into your head, apart or abstract from anything. No, it's through a material means, just like everything else. In this case, this material means, right? So it's no different. So that's why often, historically in Christianity, the church has often been called the ministry of word and sacrament. It's a common term, especially in the West. So the word and sacrament, in other words, baptism and communion, right? And that when that's disconnected, you mentioned an operative word being revelation, right? As in not the book, but the concept. Although the book is, I suppose, technically part of this, right? So part of what the bridge between what you both just said is actually has to do with the ontology of God, right? So his nature. Because he is divine and we are not, there is actually an impassable chasm between us, right? He is something that is entirely different, which is what actually really that word holiness means. It means other or separateness. Okay? By virtue of that fact that God is ontologically different from us, it is in a technical sense impossible for us in our own right or energy to bridge that gap, right?
Yeah.
It's something we're actually ontologically incapable of, okay, to use that term. We're not metaphysically capable of doing it. And so it's God who communes with Adam and Eve in the garden, okay? It's him who creates the world, who orders the world, who then creates this temple, this garden, right, in Eden, who then puts man, as in Adam and Eve, in the garden, right? It's all God along the way, right? Because it only works that way. We can't bridge the gap that direction. Only he can bridge the gap this direction. And that has a million implications that, again, we could be here all day talking about in regards to salvation. Again, the vain notions that man can achieve his salvation even via God is also then doesn't work either. The sovereignty of God in salvation, again, is what is meant to be imperative and evident as a result of these concepts, right? Blah, 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 blah. The bridge of what you're talking about, the bridge from what you said to what you said is then in this regard, in that knowledge must ultimately come founded upon and via divine revelation, which is much the point that I've made here plenty of times before, is that the core error of the Enlightenment was the detachment of human reason from divine revelation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That blah, 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 vis-a-vis the American Declaration of Independence. They're actually not self-evident. You've inherited that from at that point even, thousands of years of Christian history that has weaved its way throughout the annals of time down to you, right? And that things that were not actually self-evident, that were revealed, right? there are elements that were there were elements that were self-evident to these pagans, to these Greeks and Romans, namely that there is spiritual or divine things, right? It's not just blah blah. Those things, there's elements of that were able to be observed and known and understood, etc., etc. But the fact that there's actually one, not many, was not self-evident to them. The fact there's they had to be revealed, they had to be understood, they had to be made known, right? So there's always the element of God, because we cannot ultimately reach God in our own mortal selves because of that ontological difference. Divine, human. Transcendent, not transcendent, right? Infinite, temporal. Immortal, mortal. Like there's a whole, everything up and down the list of ontological differences, okay? Especially the transcendent and fixed dynamic. Transcendent, not transcendent, right? As a result of that then, our knowledge and our understanding of all things and anything is then utterly dependent on that same bridging of the gap as anything else, right? Two people can read this entire thing through and through and come out with completely different outcomes. One can convert and one doesn't. Because at the end of the day, the finitude of their own mind and the capture of the human condition unto sin and the curse of original sin is in a state of man that cannot be solved or resolved by ourselves. There must be divine intervention. Right? That's why. Otherwise, everyone would just come to the exact same conclusion when they just read it. All you'd have to do is just say, just read the Bible from front to back, and that would solve everything. You'd solve everything immediately, right? If that's all it was, right? But that's the exact error that we currently dwell in. We've detached human reason from divine revelation. Both are legitimate, both are real, but when uncoupled or unlinked, human reason will always falter because of original sin. And that's the concept that has developed, that developed 300 to 400 years ago, and it's what we've been now suffering from for the better part of the last quarter of a millennium. Until we fix that, we won't fix anything. We have to recouple human reason with divine revelation.